In the unforgiving heart of the Montana Territory, a man could be broken by the land by the winter or by loneliness. Jasper Stone was carved from that very land, his heart encased in a winter of its own making. When he laid eyes on the widow, Seraphil Vance, he saw not a woman in mourning, but a solution to the silence that haunted his mountain. He made her an offer that was no offer at all, a devil's bargain signed in desperation. He wasn't buying her land. He was buying her womb. What follows is not a tale of romance, but of survival grief, and the brutal collision of two shattered souls in a world where the only law was the strength in your hands and the fire in your belly. The dust of the Montana Territory settled on everything, a fine, gritty shroud that coated Seraphil Vance's black mourning dress and clung to the tear tracks on her cheeks. It had been 3 months since the fever took her Thomas, and with him, every dream they'd sown into the stubborn soil of their small homestead. The only thing that grew now was the debt at the general store and the shadow of Silas Blackwood's ambition. Blackwood was a man who consumed land the way a locust swarm consumes a wheat field. He owned the valley, all except for her 20 acres, the plot Thomas had called their corner of heaven. To Blackwood, it was an irritant, an ugly gap in his map of ownership. He'd made offers, first polite, then predatory. His last visit had left the scent of cheap whiskey and menace lingering in her small cabin long after he'd gone. A woman alone has no business with land like this. He'd sneered, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. The bank and Helena will see it my way soon enough. She was standing by Thomas's grave, a simple wooden cross overlooking the creek, when the stranger appeared. He didn't ride up the path like a civilized man. He simply emerged from the tree line, moving with a predator's silence that startled the birds into a flurry. He was immense, a monolith of a man, clad in buckskin, and furs his beard, a wild dark thicket, and his hair long and tied back with a leather thong. A Hawken rifle was cradled in one arm, as if it were an extension of his body. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, took in everything: the sagging porch, the fallow fields, the lone grave, and finally her. He stopped a respectful distance away. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, like rocks grinding together deep in the earth. "Can I help you?" Seraphil asked, her hand instinctively going to the small, cold derringer Thomas had insisted she keep in her apron pocket. "Heard in town." The man grunted, "Blackwood's pressin' you." Seraphil's spine stiffened. News traveled fast, but she didn't appreciate her troubles becoming trapper gossip. "That's my affair." The man ignored her frostiness. "Heard the bank's callin' your note. Heard you got till the end of the month." He wasn't asking. He was stating facts. "My name is Jasper Stone." The name meant nothing to her, but the sheer presence of him was overwhelming. He was the mountain itself, wild and untamable. "Mr. Stone, if you've come to make an offer on my land, you can turn around. It is not for sale." A humorless smile touched the corners of his mouth, barely visible in the tangle of his beard. "Not interested in your land, ma'am. Not to buy anyway." He took a step closer, and Seraphil fought the urge to retreat. "I own a valley 3 mountains over, trappin' lines from the Grey Bull River to the Absarokas. Got a cabin bigger'n this, a storehouse full of pelts and smoked meat. I lack for nothin'. Nothin' but a son." The sudden, brutal intimacy of his words struck her dumb. He stared at her, his gaze unwavering, stripping away her grief and her fear and leaving only her dire circumstances laid bare. "Here's my offer, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "I'll pay off the bank in Helena, every last cent. I'll run Silas Blackwood and his curs off this territory so they never bother you again. This land, this house, it'll all be yours free and clear." Seraphil stared suspicion and a wild, desperate hope warring in her chest. "For what? What would you want in return?" Jasper Stone's eyes were devoid of warmth of pity, of anything but a chilling, single-minded purpose. "You. You'll come with me. You'll be my wife." He saw the horror dawn on her face and cut her off before she could speak. "This ain't a proposal of the heart, ma'am. It's a contract. You give me sons. Healthy sons to carry my name and learn my mountains. When you've given me 2, you're free to go. Come back here, sell this land, go east, I don't care. The land will be yours, and I'll give you a stake to start over. But until then," he took the final step, his shadow falling over her, blocking out the pale afternoon sun. He was so close, she could smell the pine and wood smoke and cold steel that clung to him. "You're mine until I have sons." He growled the words a vow and a sentence. Seraphil felt the world tilt. It was monstrous. It was barbaric. Selling her body, her life for 20 acres of dirt and freedom from a bully. But the alternative was destitution. Losing Thomas's home, the last piece of him she had, and likely ending up in a much worse situation in a town like Helena. She looked from Jasper Stone's unyielding face to the simple wooden cross on the hill. Thomas had worked himself into this grave for this land. Could she let it go? Tears hot and silent welled in her eyes. Not tears of sadness for this new terrifying future, but tears of bitter grief for the man who should have been standing beside her. They were tears for the love she had lost and the cold transaction that was about to replace it. The mountain man watched the tears trace paths through the dust on her cheeks. He didn't soften. He didn't offer comfort. He simply waited, an immovable object of will, for her answer. "Yes." She whispered the word, tasting like ash in her mouth. "I agree." The journey to Jasper's cabin was a silent 3-day trek into the heart of the mountains. Seraphil rode the mule she'd packed with her meager belongings, a few dresses, her mother's Bible, and a small tin-framed photograph of her and Thomas on their wedding day. Jasper walked ahead, leading his pack horse, never looking back, his rifle a constant companion in his arms. The wilderness grew deeper, wilder, the trail dwindling to a barely discernible deer path. The world she knew, the small community, the gentle roll of the valley, vanished behind a curtain of pine and granite. His cabin was not a home. It was a fortress. Built of massive hand-hewn logs, it was nestled in a high valley, protected on 3 sides by sheer rock faces. A cold, clear river rushed by, and the air was sharp with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Inside it was stark and ruthlessly functional. A stone fireplace big enough to roast a deer dominated one wall. A long plank table, a few stools, and a single cot covered in buffalo hides occupied the main room. Pelts were stacked in neat piles, and tools hung from wooden pegs with military precision. There was no softness, no sign that a woman had ever set foot in this place. There was no hint of his past. "Your room," he grunted, gesturing to a small, curtained-off alcove. Inside was another cot, narrower than his own, and a small chest. Food's in the larder. Water's from the river. Don't wander off. There's grizzlies and wolves. The first few weeks were a study in suffocating silence. Jasper was a ghost in his own house. He would rise before dawn, his movements quiet and efficient, and disappear into the mountains for the entire day, returning only after dusk. He would eat the simple meal she prepared, usually some kind of stew from the meat he provided in silence, his eyes fixed on the fire. He never spoke of his day, and he never asked about hers. He made it clear that their marriage a brief, joyless affair before a traveling justice of the peace he'd arranged to meet on the trail was a means to an end. On the third night, he came to her alcove. He didn't speak, didn't try to kiss her, didn't offer a single word of comfort or gentleness. He simply pulled back the curtain, his shadow looming over her. His touch was not cruel, but it was devoid of any emotion, a methodical, detached act to fulfill his side of the bargain. Seraphiel lay rigid, staring at the canvas ceiling, praying for it to be over her mind, a numb, gray void. It was a duty, a payment on a debt, and it left her feeling hollowed out, scoured clean of any warmth. Loneliness became her constant companion. She tried to make the cabin her own, sweeping the floors, airing out the furs, even attempting to plant a small herb garden in a patch of sun near the door. Jasper never commented his indifference, a wall she could not breach. Her only solace was the small photograph of Thomas. She kept it hidden in the chest, and at night, by the light of a single candle, she would take it out. She'd trace his familiar smiling face with her finger, whispering to him, telling him about her day, about her fear, her sorrow. It was in these moments that the tears would come silent and scalding. One evening, Jasper returned earlier than usual, the carcass of a young buck slung over his shoulder. He moved so quietly that she didn't hear him enter. He found her sitting on her cot, the tin-framed photograph in her hands, tears streaming down her face. He stopped dead in the doorway of the alcove. His face, usually a mask of stoicism, darkened with something she couldn't read. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was harsher, colder. "What's that?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. She quickly tried to hide the photograph, but it was too late. He strode forward, his massive frame filling the small space, and wrenched it from her grasp. He stared at the smiling faces of Seraphiel and Thomas, his thumb brushing over the glass. "Put it away," he commanded, his voice tight. "He was my husband." Seraphiel whispered, a spark of defiance cutting through her fear. "I loved him. He's dead." Jasper stated the words like stones. "He can't protect you. He can't give you a son. He's dust." Crying over him does no good. He thrust the photograph back at her. "Your concern is the future, not the past, my sons." The sheer brutal cruelty of it broke something inside her. All the fear, the loneliness, the humiliation of their nights together coalesced into a single sharp point of pain. "You think that's all I am?" she cried, her voice rising with a strength that surprised them both. "A vessel, a broodmare for your precious sons. I had a life, I had love, something you clearly know nothing about. You can buy my time, Mr. Stone. You can force my body. But you do not own my memories. You do not own my tears." She snatched the photograph, clutching it to her chest, as if it were a shield. Her body shook with sobs, no longer silent and hidden, but raw, and ragged torn from the depths of her soul. Jasper stood frozen watching her. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked uncertain. The anger in his face warred with a flicker of something else, a deep ancient pain. He saw her not as the solution to his problem, but as a woman shattered by grief, and in her brokenness, he saw a faint, terrifying reflection of his own. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't speak another word. He turned on his heel and stalked out of the cabin, slamming the heavy wooden door behind him. He went to the woodpile and began to split logs with a furious mechanical violence, the rhythmic thud of the axe echoing through the silent valley, each blow a strike against a memory he had buried long ago. For the first time, the widow's tears had done more than fall on the floorboards. They had struck him and found a crack in the stone. After their confrontation, the silence in the cabin changed. It was no longer empty, but heavy, charged with the unspoken words from that night. Jasper grew even more remote, his absences stretching longer sometimes for 2 days at a time. When he was there, he avoided her eyes, the gruff certainty in his demeanor, replaced by a brooding, restless energy. Seraphiel, for her part, felt a small, hard kernel of strength solidify within her. She had spoken her truth, and though it had changed nothing tangible, it had changed her. She would not be erased. The first snows of autumn arrived early, dusting the high peaks with white, and bringing a vicious biting wind that whistled through the chinks in the cabin logs. Seraphiel, accustomed to the milder valley climate, was unprepared for the sudden deep cold. A chill took root in her bones, and within a day it blossomed into a raging fever. She awoke one morning shivering uncontrollably, her body slick with sweat, despite the layers of blankets. The room swam, and a fiery pain seared her lungs with every breath. She tried to rise to fetch water, but collapsed back onto the cot, her limbs heavy as lead. Jasper found her like that when he returned from checking a line of traps near the ridge. He came in stomping snow from his boots and stopped short when he saw her. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his huge calloused hand pressing against her forehead. It was a gesture so unexpectedly gentle that in her delirium, Seraphiel almost wept. "Fever," he grunted. His face was a grim mask, but his eyes held a new, unfamiliar light concern. Or perhaps she thought hazily it was fear. Fear of his investment failing. For the next 4 days, Jasper did not leave the cabin. The mountain man, the silent force of nature, became a reluctant nurse. He moved with a surprising deftness, brewing a bitter tea from willow bark that brought down her fever. He bathed her face and neck with cool water from the river. He sat by her cot through the long, dark nights, listening to her ragged breathing, adding logs to the fire to keep the relentless cold at bay. In her fevered state, Seraphiel drifted between nightmares and fragmented memories of Thomas. She cried out his name in her sleep, her hands clutching at the blankets. Jasper, sitting in the firelight, would watch her, his jaw tight, a muscle twitching in his cheek. On the 3rd night, her fever broke. She awoke weak but lucid to find him spooning a thin, hot broth into her mouth. His touch was careful, his movements measured. "Thank you." She rasped, her throat raw. He just grunted, not meeting her eyes. He finished feeding her, and then sat back on his stool, staring into the flames. The silence stretched, but it was different now, less hostile. "You've done this before?" Seraphiel said, her voice barely a whisper. tended the sick. He didn't answer for a long time. The only sound was the crackle and hiss of the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, dredged up from a place of deep pain. "I had a wife," he said, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "Sarah. We had a cabin down on the Powder River. Prettier than this place. Gentler." Seraphiel held her breath, knowing this was a door that had been sealed for years, now creaking open an inch. "We had 2 boys. He continued, his voice flat devoid of emotion, as if he were reciting a list of supplies. "Jacob, he was 5, had his mother's smile, and little Samuel, just a babe." He fell silent again, his big hands clenching and unclenching on his knees. "Winter of '68, lung fever, same as this. It came on fast, took Samuel in 2 days. Jacob fought for a week." He swallowed hard, the sound loud in the quiet room. "Sarah, she lasted the longest. She held my hand and made me promise I wouldn't let the silence take me, that I'd build again." He finally turned his head and looked at Seraphiel, and for the first time she saw past the mountain man, past the hard bargainer, and saw the hollowed-out shell of a husband and father. His eyes were not the color of a cold winter sky, but of a frozen lake with a profound and terrible grief locked deep beneath the ice. "I buried all 3 of them on a hill overlooking the river," he said, his voice cracking on the last word. "Then I burned the cabin to the ground and walked into these mountains. Never looked back." The truth of him, the source of his monstrous bargain, settled over Seraphiel. His obsession with sons wasn't about legacy or pride. It was a desperate, mad attempt to fill a hole in his soul so vast it had swallowed his entire world. He wasn't trying to build a new family. He was trying to resurrect the dead one. She didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry," felt like a pebble thrown into a canyon. Instead, she reached out a weak, trembling hand and laid it on his arm. His muscles were rigid as oak, but he didn't pull away. They sat there for a long time in the flickering firelight, 2 strangers bound by a cold contract, now suddenly, unexpectedly, tethered by a shared landscape of grief. The fever had broken in Seraphiel, but in that moment of shared vulnerability, something had also broken in Jasper. A tiny crack in the stone through which a fragile human light was beginning to seep. As Seraphiel regained her strength, the atmosphere in the cabin settled into a new cautious rhythm. The chasm between them remained, but now it was bridged by the fragile thread of Jasper's confession. He still kept his distance, but there was a subtle change in his manner. He would occasionally tell her the name of a bird calling from the pines, or point out the track of a mountain lion in the fresh snow. Small offerings, but for a man like Jasper, they were more telling than 1,000 words of apology. Seraphiel in turn began to see the mountain not as her prison, but as his sanctuary. She understood now that his harshness was a shield, his silence a defense against a pain that was always lurking just beneath the surface. She stopped hiding the photograph of Thomas. She placed it on the small chest in her alcove, a quiet declaration that her past was a part of her, just as his was a part of him. Jasper saw it, but said nothing. Their fragile peace was shattered on a crisp, sunlit afternoon a month later. Seraphiel was outside gathering firewood when she heard the sound of approaching horses, more than one. Her heart leapt into her throat. Jasper was miles away checking his far-flung southern trap lines and wasn't due back until evening. 3 men rode into the clearing. The man in the lead was Silas Blackwood, his face flushed with whiskey and arrogance. The 2 men with him were cut from a harder cloth, their eyes cold and their hands resting near the holsters on their hips. "Well, well," Blackwood called out, his voice slick with false charm as he dismounted. "The blushing bride. I must say, Mrs. Stone Mountain living seems to suit you." His gaze was an insult, raking over her from head to toe. "What do you want, Mr. Blackwood?" Seraphiel asked, her voice steady despite the frantic pounding of her heart. She stood her ground, the axe she'd been using for kindling held loosely in her hand. "I've come to renegotiate," he said, smiling. "Seems your mountain man husband paid off that note in Helena. Very noble. But he ain't here now, is he? And this is a lonely place. A lot can happen up here." He took a step closer. "I'm a reasonable man. I'll give you $500, cash, for you to sign over the deed to that little plot in the valley and disappear. A much better deal than the one you've got with him, I'd wager." "The land is not for sale." Seraphiel said, her knuckles white on the axe handle. "And my husband will be back soon." Blackwood laughed a short, ugly sound. "Oh, I'm counting on it. I want him to find you gone. I want him to know that what Silas Blackwood wants he gets." He nodded to one of his men. Caleb convinced the lady. The hired gun, a lanky man with a scarred face, grinned and started walking toward her. Seraphiel's mind raced. The cabin. The derringer was in her apron, hanging on a peg inside. But the door was behind her. As the man reached for her, a voice cut through the air cold and deadly as a winter wind. "Touch her, and you'll lose that hand." Jasper stood at the edge of the tree line, not 30 yards away. He was a terrifying sight. He hadn't been on the southern line. He must have been circling back. His Hawken rifle was at his shoulder, its long barrel aimed squarely at the scar-faced man's chest. He was as still as the granite cliffs behind him, a figure of pure lethal intent. Blackwood and his men froze. "Stone." Blackwood stammered, his bravado evaporating. "We were just having a conversation with your wife." "Looked like more than a conversation." Jasper said, his voice dangerously low. He took a slow, deliberate step out of the trees. "You were told to stay away from her land. Now see here." Blackwood blustered, trying to regain his footing. "This is a business matter. This is my valley." Jasper snarled, the sound ripping from his throat, more animal than human. "My home. My wife." He said the word with a possessive force that sent a shiver down Seraphiel's spine. It was no longer about a contract. This was personal. "You have 10 seconds to get on your horses and ride out. If I see you or your men anywhere near my land or hers again, I will not warn you. I will plant you where you stand." The scar-faced man slowly raised his hands. The other gunman looked nervously at Blackwood, who was pale and sweating despite the cold. The sheer, unadulterated menace rolling off Jasper was a palpable force. They were armed, 3 of them, but they knew they were facing a man who was part of the wilderness itself, and in this place he was king. Without another word, they scrambled back onto their horses. Blackwood fumbled with his reins, his eyes wide with fear. "This isn't over, Stone." He yelled a pathetic attempt at defiance as he spurred his horse and galloped away, his men close behind. Jasper kept the rifle trained on their backs until they disappeared from sight. Only then did he lower it, the tension draining from his body. He walked toward Seraphiel, his eyes scanning her, searching for any sign of harm. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with the remnants of his rage. "No," she whispered, her body trembling with adrenaline. "You came back." "This is my home," he repeated, looking not at her, but at the cabin, the trees, the mountains that cradled them. "I protect what's mine." But Seraphiel knew in that moment that something profound had shifted. He hadn't just been protecting his property or his investment in a future son. He had seen a threat to her, and he had transformed from a brooding stranger into a ferocious guardian. She had seen the raw, untamed power he possessed, and for the first time, she had not been its target, but its beneficiary. He had fought for her, and in doing so, had bound them together in a way their cold, loveless vows never could. The failed intimidation by Silas Blackwood became a turning point. The violence of the encounter and Jasper's primal defense of her had broken down the last of the formal barriers between them. The nights were still chaste. Ever since her fever, he had not come to her alcove, but the days were filled with a new tentative communication. He began to teach her, not with words, but with actions. He showed her how to read the weather in the clouds, how to identify edible plants from poisonous ones, how to set a simple snare. He took her to the river and showed her the patient, silent art of fishing for trout. Seraphiel, in turn, started bringing a semblance of warmth to the sterile cabin. She found wild mint to make tea, used her meager sewing skills to patch his buckskins, and learned to bake a passable cornbread in the Dutch oven by the hearth. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, trapping them in the cabin's cocoon of firelight, Seraphiel found the courage to ask. "Jasper," she began, her voice soft. "Sarah, your wife, what was she like?" He was sharpening a skinning knife by the fire, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound. He paused, his big hands still. For a moment she thought he would retreat back into his silence. Instead, he set the knife down and looked into the flames. She was sunlight. He said the word, sounding foreign on his lips. She came from Ohio, a preacher's daughter, saw the good in everything, in everyone. A sad smile touched his lips. "Even me. She said I was a thunderstorm she wanted to learn to dance in." He told her about their life on the Powder River, about how Sarah had planted a garden of bright yellow flowers that had no business growing in the harsh soil, but did anyway, just for her. He spoke of his son Jacob, who was fearless and wild, always trying to keep up with his father, his small hands fumbling to copy how Jasper set a trap or cleaned a fish. He even spoke of the infant Samuel, of the surprising weight of such a small child in his arms. As he spoke, Seraphiel didn't just see the mountain man. She saw the young, hopeful husband, the proud father. She saw the man Sarah had loved. The stone was gone, and in its place was a man with scars so deep they defined his very soul. When he finished, a profound quiet filled the room. Seraphiel felt her own grief for Thomas rise up, not as a sharp pain, but as a gentle, familiar ache. Thomas was like that. She found herself saying, her voice a near whisper. He saw the best in people. He was a farmer from Pennsylvania. He believed if you treated the land with kindness, it would be kind back to you. He would have liked your Sarah's flowers. Jasper looked at her, truly looked at her, his gaze holding hers across the flickering space between them. In his eyes, she saw not just his own pain, but an understanding of hers. He was no longer dismissing her tears as a weakness. He was recognizing their source. He was seeing her grief as a mirror of his own. "Tell me about him," he said, his voice a low rumble. And so she did. She told him about Thomas's laugh, about his terrible singing voice, about his dream of building a real house with glass windows. She took out the tin-framed photograph, and this time she didn't clutch it to her chest like a shield. She handed it to him. Jasper took it carefully, his rough, scarred fingers gentle on the tin. He looked at the smiling man with his arm around a younger, happier Seraphiel. He stared at it for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he handed it back. "He looks like a good man," he said quietly. It was an absolution, an acknowledgement of her past, of her love. In that moment, they were no longer Jasper Stone and Seraphiel Vance, the mountain man and the widow. They were just two people shipwrecked by life who had finally found another survivor on the shore. Later that night, Seraphiel lay awake on her cot, listening to the wind howl. The curtain to her alcove was pushed aside. Jasper stood there a silhouette against the dying embers of the fire. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there watching her. There was no demand in his presence, no cold duty. There was only a question, a profound and silent asking. She lifted the edge of her blanket in invitation. He crossed the small space and lay down beside her, not on top of her. He was careful, as if he were handling something precious and fragile. When he touched her face, his hand was hesitant, his callous thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. It wasn't the touch of a man claiming his property. It was the touch of a man who was afraid of a man who hadn't known softness in a very, very long time. And when they came together, it was not a transaction. It was a slow, gentle exploration, a quiet collision of two lonely souls seeking warmth against the storm, both inside and out. It was not the passionate fire she had known with Thomas, nor was it the cold duty of their first weeks together. It was something new, a fragile, tentative flicker of hope in the heart of a long winter. The thaw had finally begun. In the months that followed, the deep snows of winter melted, feeding the roaring river and bringing a startling explosion of green to the high valley. Just as the land was reawakening, so too was the life within the cabin. The quiet companionship that had taken root during the blizzard blossomed in the spring sun. Jasper and Seraphiel fell into a rhythm that felt less like a contract and more like a partnership. They moved around each other with an easy familiarity, their days punctuated by shared tasks and comfortable silences. He would bring her a fistful of early wildflowers when he returned from his trap lines. She would save him the last piece of her freshly baked bread. They were small gestures, but they were the mortar that was slowly, carefully rebuilding the foundations of their lives. The physical intimacy between them grew, becoming a source of comfort and discovery. Jasper, who had only ever known the dutiful act of fulfilling his bargain, learned the language of tenderness from her. Seraphiel, who thought love had been buried forever with Thomas, found herself responding to this scarred, silent man with a warmth that surprised her. She was drawn to the deep well of gentleness hidden beneath his rugged exterior, a gentleness he seemed to be rediscovering himself. One morning in late spring, Seraphil knew. It was a subtle shift in her body, a quiet certainty that had been growing for weeks. She was carrying a child. Her first reaction was not joy, but a cold wave of fear. This was it. The purpose of the bargain. Would the return of his single-minded obsession shatter the fragile peace they had built? She waited until evening, until they were sitting by the fire, the day's work done. Jasper was carving a piece of wood, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Jasper," she said, her hands twisting in her lap. He looked up his knife, pausing mid-stroke. "What is it, you're pale?" "I'm with child." The words hung in the air between them. Jasper stared at her, his face completely blank. The small wooden figure, a roughly carved bird, fell from his lifeless fingers and landed softly on the hearthstone. He didn't seem to notice. He just stared at her belly, then back to her face. Seraphil braced herself for the gruff satisfaction, the triumphant grunt of a man whose contract was finally bearing fruit. Instead, she saw stark, undiluted terror in his eyes. The same terror she had seen the night he spoke of the lung fever. The fear of a man who had been given the world, only to have it ripped from his hands. He rose from his stool and crossed to her, dropping to his knees before her chair. It was a gesture of such startling humility from this mountain of a man that it took her breath away. He reached out a trembling hand, not to her belly, but to her face, cupping her cheek as if she were made of delicate glass. "Are you well?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "You're not sick. No fever." "No, Jasper. I'm well," she reassured him, placing her hand over his. "I'm strong." He closed his eyes, his forehead resting against hers, and took a shuddering breath. "I can't lose you. Seraphil," he whispered the words, a raw, broken confession. I can't do it again." It wasn't about the son. It was about her. The realization washed over Seraphil with the force of a tidal wave. In his fear, in his vulnerability, he had laid his heart bare. The goal he had been so brutally focused on had been eclipsed by something he had never expected to feel again. He was terrified of losing his wife, not the mother of his child. From that day on, he treated her with an almost suffocating care. He forbade her from lifting anything heavy, from venturing too far from the cabin. He brought her the freshest meat, the tenderest greens. He would sit for hours watching her, a vigilant guardian against the ghosts of his past. His terror was matched only by his wonder. One evening, he hesitantly placed his hand on her swelling abdomen. His eyes went wide as he felt the first faint flutter of life within. A slow, incredulous smile spread across his face, a genuine soul-deep smile that transformed his rugged features. It was the first time Seraphil had ever seen him truly happy. The bargain had been for a son, a replacement for what was lost. But as Seraphil's belly grew, they both began to realize that what was happening was not a replacement. It was not an attempt to fill an old gaping wound. It was something entirely new. It was a new beginning, born not of a cold contract, but of a shared and hard-won tenderness. But high on a mountain, new life is a fragile thing, and the shadows of the past, both his and hers, were long and not yet ready to let them go. Summer settled over the high valley, thick and warm. The days were long, and a sense of peaceful anticipation filled the cabin. Jasper's fears for Seraphil's health slowly subsided, replaced by a quiet, joyful reverence. He talked to the baby, his deep voice rumbling against Seraphiel's belly, telling it stories of the mountains, of the eagles that soared on the thermals, and the cunning of the fox. He was no longer a man haunted by ghosts, but a man eagerly awaiting a new life. Their idyllic peace was a fragile bubble, and it was destined to burst. One afternoon, while Jasper was checking a rockfall on the western trail, Seraphiel noticed a thin plume of smoke rising from the lower woods far too close to the cabin to be a natural fire. A knot of dread tightened in her stomach. Silas Blackwood. She grabbed Jasper's second rifle, the smaller, lighter repeater he had taught her to use. Her hands were steady. The terrified widow, who had agreed to a desperate bargain, was gone. In her place was a woman defending her home, her husband, her unborn child. She didn't have to wait long. It wasn't a full-on assault. Blackwood was a coward, not a general. He and his 2 hired guns were using the fire as a distraction creeping up the rocky path toward the cabin. Seraphiel waited behind the thick log wall, the rifle resting on the sill of the window. When Blackwood's scar-faced man broke cover, she fired. She didn't aim to kill, but to terrify. The shot splintered the rock inches from his head, sending him scrambling back with a yelp. "She's armed," he shouted. "It's one woman." Blackwood roared back, his voice tight with frustration. "Get up there." A second shot, this one kicking up dirt at Blackwood's own feet, sent them all diving for cover. The standoff was a tense one. They had her pinned, but they were afraid to approach the cabin, which had become a small fortress. The stalemate was broken by a sound that made Seraphiel's blood run both hot and cold, the roar of Jasper's Hawken rifle from high up on the ridge behind them. It was a deep, booming cannon shot that echoed through the valley. One of Blackwood's men screamed and clutched his shoulder, his pistol clattering to the ground. Jasper had circled around them. He was hunting them. What followed was not a gunfight, but a systematic dismantling of Blackwood's pathetic ambitions. Jasper moved through the forest like a spirit silent and unseen. Another shot, and the scar-faced man's rifle was torn from his hands, the stock shattering into splinters. He fled crashing through the underbrush like a panicked deer. Now it was just Blackwood alone and terrified, trapped between Seraphiel in the cabin and Jasper on the ridge. "Stone, damn you!" he shrieked into the trees. "Let's talk about this." "No more talk. Blackwood." Jasper's voice boomed from the rocks, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "You threatened my wife. You came to my home." In a final desperate act of malice, Blackwood pulled his pistol, not aiming at the ridge, but at Seraphiel in the cabin window. He never fired the shot. An arrow fletched with hawk feathers sprouted from his gun hand with a sickening thud. He screamed, dropping the pistol, and stared in disbelief at the shaft pinning his hand to the wooden frame of the cabin porch. Jasper had closed the distance, trading his rifle for his bow. He emerged from the trees, a fearsome, avenging angel in buckskin, his face a mask of cold fury. He strode to Blackwood, who was whimpering on the ground, and ripped the arrow out, tossing the man's useless hand aside. "This is my only mercy." Jasper growled, his voice a low final judgment. "Leave this territory. Leave Montana. If I ever see your face again, I will not wound you. I will end you." He grabbed Blackwood by his collar, hauled him to his feet, and threw him toward the trail. Now run. Blackwood, bleeding and broken, stumbled away, his reign of terror over for good. Jasper turned and ran to the cabin, his face etched with worry. He burst through the door and found Seraphiel pale but unharmed, the repeater still held tightly in her hands. He enfolded her in his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. I thought, he started, his voice choked. We're fine, she whispered into his chest. We protected our home. We. The words sealed it. 2 weeks later, as the first autumn leaves began to turn, Seraphiel's labor began. It was long and difficult. Jasper, who had faced down grizzlies and blizzards without flinching, was terrified. He held her hand, bathed her brow, and murmured words of encouragement, his voice a constant, steady presence in her sea of pain. And then, with the first light of dawn, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold, their child was born. Jasper held the swaddled babe in his massive hands, his face a canvas of awe and disbelief. He looked at Seraphiel, his eyes shining with tears. Jasper, she said, her voice tired but happy, I want you to see. With a trembling finger, he gently parted the blanket. He had been so certain, so focused on his need for sons, for replacements of Jacob and Samuel. He looked, and then he laughed, a deep rumbling laugh that shook his whole body, a laugh of pure, unadulterated joy. It was a girl, a perfect, healthy little girl, with a fuzz of dark hair and eyes the color of a stormy sky, just like her father's. He looked from his daughter's face to his wife's, and the last of the stone crumbled away, washed clean by the widow's tears, and the love that had grown in the wildest of places. He didn't see the ghost of Sarah or the shadows of his lost boys. He saw Seraphiel, his wife, his partner, his salvation. And he saw his daughter, not a replacement, but a new beginning. She's beautiful. He whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he thought long dead. What should we name her? Seraphiel smiled, her heart full. Hope, she said. Let's call her Hope. He no longer needed sons. He didn't need to reclaim his past. He just needed them, his family. The first winter of Hope's life descended upon the mountains not as a gentle blanket of white, but as an invading army. The winds howled with a malevolent fury, and the snows fell relentlessly, burying the valley deeper each day. Inside the cabin, however, a fragile warmth held the brutal cold at bay. The stone hearth, which had once been a symbol of Jasper's cold isolation, was now the heart of a home. The cabin was filled with new sounds, the soft gurgles of a baby, the gentle creak of the cradle Jasper had painstakingly carved from a single piece of pine, and the sound of Seraphiel humming lullabies, her voice a quiet thread of contentment weaving through their lives. For months, Jasper had been a man transformed. The joy he took in his daughter was a raw, powerful thing. He would hold her for hours, her tiny head nestled in the crook of his massive arm, and simply watch her, his rugged face softened by a look of pure wonder. He was no longer the mountain man who had bought a wife. He was a father utterly and completely devoted. But the past is not a country one can simply leave behind. It is a landscape that shapes the soul, and its deepest valleys can reappear without warning. It started with a cough, a small, wet sound from the cradle that was perfectly normal for a baby in the dry, smoky air of a winter cabin. To Seraphiel, it was a minor concern. To Jasper, it was the thunderclap before the storm. He froze the piece of leather he was mending falling from his hands. His eyes darted to the cradle, and the open, joyful expression on his face vanished, replaced by the haunted, grim mask of the man she had first met. "It's just a cough, Jasper," Seraphil said softly, but he didn't seem to hear her. That night he didn't sleep. Seraphil would wake in the deep silent hours to see him sitting on his stool by the fire, his back ramrod straight his rifle across his lap, watching the cradle. He wasn't just watching. He was standing guard, a sentinel against an invisible enemy. The cough persisted, and with each small sound from their daughter, another layer of stone seemed to re-encase Jasper's heart. He grew silent, his movements once again becoming clipped and ruthlessly efficient. He stopped talking to Hope, stopped holding her. He would only stand over her cradle, his hand hovering inches from her chest, as if he could feel for the fever he was so terrified would come. Seraphil knew he wasn't just seeing Hope. He was seeing Jacob. He was seeing Samuel. He was hearing the echoes of that terrible winter on the Powder River. One evening, after 3 days of this tense, suffocating vigil, she could bear it no longer. Hope was sleeping peacefully, her breathing soft and even. Jasper stood by the hearth, staring into the flames, his entire body rigid with a pain he refused to voice. "You're scaring her," Seraphil said, her voice cutting through the silence. "You're scaring me." He flinched, but didn't turn. "The wind is getting in. I need to pack the gaps with moss tomorrow." "This is not about the wind, and you know it," she said, walking to stand beside him. She reached out to touch his arm, and it was like touching granite. "Talk to me, Jasper. Don't shut me out. We are not back there. I am not Sarah." At the mention of his first wife's name, a shudder went through him. He finally turned to face her, and the anguish in his eyes was so profound it stole her breath. "What if you are—" He rasped, his voice a broken thing. "This place, this life, it gives, and then it takes. It gives you sunlight, just to show you how dark the shadows can be. I held my sons as they grew cold in my arms. I felt their last breaths. I can't." His voice cracked, and he looked at the cradle. "I cannot do it again, Seraphil. Loving her this much. It feels like I'm just sharpening the blade for my own heart." Oh, the brutal honesty of his confession laid his terror bare. He was pulling away, not from a lack of love, but from an excess of it. His fear was a shield meant to protect him from a pain he knew he could not survive a second time. Seraphil took his huge, calloused hand in both of hers. "Listen to me," she said, her voice fierce and unwavering. "Thomas used to say that fear was a thief. It steals the joy from today in the name of a tomorrow that may never happen. Your fear is stealing you from your daughter. She needs the father who smiles at her, not the guard who watches her like a hawk. I need my husband, not a ghost." She led him to the cradle and pointed at their sleeping child. "She is not Jacob. She is not Samuel. She is Hope, our Hope. And she is a fighter. She has your strength and my stubbornness. But she cannot fight this battle for you. You have to stop letting your ghosts raise your child. We have to do it together." Jasper looked down at his daughter, then back at his wife, at her face illuminated by the firelight, her eyes shining with tears and an unshakable strength. She was right. He had been so consumed by the echoes of the past that he was deafening himself to the beauty of the present. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached into the cradle. He did not check for fever. He did not listen for a cough. He simply laid his finger in his daughter's tiny palm. Her fingers, impossibly small, curled around his with surprising strength. It was not a grip of sickness or fragility. It was a grasp of life, of presence, of a future yet unwritten. A single tear traced a path through the grit on his cheek. It was not a tear of grief for what was lost, but a tear of fierce, terrifying, beautiful love for what he had found. He pulled Seraphiel close with his free arm, and together they stood in the warm circle of the firelight, watching their daughter sleep, a united family, against the howling winter and the quiet echoes in the valley. And so, in the heart of the wild mountains, the story of Jasper Stone and Seraphiel Vance found its true beginning. It wasn't a story of a bargain fulfilled, but of a bargain transformed. A mountain man, broken by a grief so vast it turned his heart to stone, thought he could command life to bend to his will. But he learned that a heart can't be rebuilt with demands, only healed by unexpected love. The widow's tears didn't just break him. They washed away the pain of the past and watered the seeds of a future he never thought possible. Their tale reminds us that even in the harshest landscapes and from the most broken of beginnings, the most resilient things can grow. Forgiveness, partnership, and hope. If this story of love and survival in the Old West moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates a tale of true grit and redemption. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next story from the pages of history. Let us know in the comments below which part of Jasper and Seraphiel's journey resonated with you the most. Thank you for listening.